Before we start, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. Your support helps me bring you more powerful life stories that truly touch the heart. Thank you for being here. For 10 years he paid no attention to the strange hill beside the barn, but as soon as he started digging, his discovery made him immediately call the police. Please subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. George Peterson had lived alone for so many years that the creaking of old floorboards and the whisper of wind through the eaves had become his only constant companions. At 76, his life moved at a pace as slow and measured as the changing seasons, and he preferred exactly that rhythm. His small weathered house stood at the very edge of a sleepy southern town, far from the busy streets where children played and neighbors exchanged gossip on their porches. Here there was only the rustle of leaves, the chirping of cicadas in summer, and the low hum of the distant highway, a reminder that the world still turned beyond the quiet boundaries of his life. The yard around the house told the story of a man who had once worked the earth with his own hands. The grass was uneven but well tended. Vegetable beds grew in stubborn neat rows despite the sandy soil. And beside the house, an old wooden barn leaned slightly, as if tired from many years of storing the scents of oil, rust, and cedar. George spent most of his day here, repairing tools or simply standing in the doorway, watching the lights slide across the ground. The barn, like George himself, had weathered storms and sun without complaint. It was behind this barn, along the far edge of his property near the old fence, that the strange hill had first appeared. He remembered noticing it shortly after moving here almost 10 years ago. At first it was nothing, just a gentle rise in the earth, the kind you might find after heavy rain when water washes soil from one place to another. He thought little of it, assuming it was the result of uneven terrain or perhaps settling ground after previous owners had removed a tree. In those early days, he had too many other concerns. He was adjusting to life after selling the farm, to the loss of his wife Claudia, and to how silence seemed to fill the spaces where her voice had once sounded. George's days were simple now. He woke before dawn, more from habit than necessity, and brewed strong coffee. In the mornings when the air was cool and dew still clung to the grass, he would sit on the porch with his cup and watch the first blush of sunlight creep across the fields beyond his property. He loved the silence of that hour, when even the birds seemed hesitant to begin their song. The hill behind the barn wasn't an urgent matter in those moments. It was simply an irregularity in the ground, one of many small details that made up the landscape of his life. But over the years, the hill had changed. At first it was barely noticeable, perhaps an inch higher in one season, slightly wider in the next. George noticed that the grass on its crest was never as green as the rest of the yard, as if the soil beneath reluctantly nourished whatever tried to grow there. Sometimes after long periods without rain, the earth would crack along its ridge, exposing a dark, compacted layer beneath. He would look at it while trimming the fence line, frowning slightly, but always found an excuse to leave it alone. It's just the ground settling, he told himself. Nothing more. The truth was that George wasn't a man who dug without reason. Decades of farming had taught him to respect the land and the secrets it sometimes kept. He knew that what lay beneath soil could be as harmless as a forgotten tree root or as problematic as an old septic line. But there was something about this hill, something in the way it seemed to shift slightly each year, that drew his attention. On warm days when the sun cast long shadows across the yard, George sometimes found himself standing at the edge of the hill, staring down at it. The barn loomed nearby, its wooden siding darkened by time, and the air was heavy with the scent of cut grass. He would tap the hill lightly with the toe of his boot, feeling the hardness of the earth, too hard for just loose soil. And once, he couldn't remember if it was 3 years ago or 4, he thought he heard a faint metallic sound when he struck it. But the moment passed quickly, and he told himself it was nothing more than a stone buried deep below. Neighbors rarely visited, but those who did sometimes remarked on his quiet existence. They saw a solitary man who kept to himself, who maintained his yard and waved politely but never lingered in conversation. They didn't know that George's mind was often occupied with memories of the farm he had once run with his brother before the land was sold, of years in the army that had taken him overseas, and of long evenings spent on the porch with Claudia, talking about everything and nothing. The hill was a minor curiosity compared to the weight of those memories. Nevertheless, each year the hill became more prominent until it could no longer be ignored. During rainy months, puddles formed around its base, but the top remained strangely dry. Water rolled off it as if repelled. In summer, the grass on its slopes thinned, leaving bare patches of soil that baked under the sun. And always there was that sense of something beneath the ground. Something solid, immovable, and patient. George told himself he would deal with it someday. Perhaps when the weather turned cooler or when he felt more inclined to dig. But he never did. Seasons came and went, and the hill remained, slowly but steadily growing, as if waiting for him to pay it attention. He didn't speak of it to anyone, not even the few old friends who still called from time to time. It was his land, his barn, his hill. Whatever it was, it could wait. That fall, however, something changed, not in the hill itself, but in George's perception of it. The air was crisp and leaves had begun to fall, scattering across the yard like fragments of gold and copper. One morning, walking to the barn for a rake, he stopped beside the hill and realized it now reached almost to his knee. It cast a small but definite shadow in the morning light, and for the first time looked not like a natural formation but like something placed there deliberately. He stood there for a long time, forgetting about the rake in his hand, studying the slope of earth. The ground beneath his boot felt harder than ever, and he thought he caught that metallic resonance again when he tapped it. A faint memory stirred in the back of his mind of places overseas where he had seen similar rises in the earth, where soldiers whispered about what might be buried beneath them. The thought disturbed him, though he quickly dismissed it. This was his backyard, not some distant battlefield. Yet the unease lingered. By the time he returned to the porch that evening, the sun had set in a blaze of red and gold, and the hill was just a dark shape in the fading light. George sat in his chair, sipping coffee, his eyes drifting once more to the barn and the ground beside it. He told himself, as he had many times before, that there was no hurry. But deep down he knew the truth. The hill had been patient enough, and sooner or later he would have to decide what to do about it. The first frost came early that year, bringing with it the brittle silence of late autumn. George felt the change in the air before he stepped outside each morning. The scent of cut grass and warm earth had given way to the sharp bite of cold, and the ground crunched slightly underfoot. He went about his business as always, bundling up in a thick coat and pulling his cap low over his brow. But something about the light of that season made the hill behind the barn stand out more sharply than ever before. It was no longer just an irregularity in the ground blending into the yard. It was a presence. He could see it from his porch now, even at a distance, and it seemed to have acquired a strange significance in the landscape. Frost gathered on it differently than on the rest of the yard. While the surrounding grass sparkled silver in the morning sun, the ridge of the hill was often bare, as if frost melted there first or never fully formed. George found this troubling. He told himself it was probably due to the shape, perhaps catching more sunlight. But deep down he suspected something else, something beneath the surface generating its own subtle heat, or simply resisting the cold as living soil should not. On a particularly damp morning, George carried his coffee to the barn and stopped halfway. His eyes were drawn to the base of the hill. The grass there had thinned even more, exposing dark earth packed hard as brick. He crouched, pressing his palm against it. Even through his glove, he could feel the density of the ground, a density that didn't belong to natural soil. The memory of that faint metallic sound from years past whispered in his mind. He slowly pulled his hand away, as if afraid the ground might shift beneath his touch. The following week brought heavy rains. Strong storms rolled through the town, filling ditches and swelling the creek that wound behind neighboring properties. George watched from his window as water streamed across the yard, pooling in shallow depressions and soaking into the earth. But when he looked at the hill, he noticed something odd. Water collected at its base but never pooled on top. It was as if the ground there was thirsty, drawing in rain faster than nature allowed. One morning after a night of steady downpour, he went out at dawn and found the hill's crest dry while puddles spread across the rest of the property. It was that morning when an old rumor from his army days surfaced in his mind. Stories of caches buried in remote places, their containers sealed so tightly they shifted and pressed against the earth over the years. He dismissed the thought, but it clung to him stubbornly throughout the day, following him from barn to porch and even into the small kitchen where he prepared dinner. One afternoon a neighbor stopped by while George was repairing a section of fence. It was Ivan Johnson, a man nearing 70 who had lived in the area longer than anyone could remember. He leaned against a fence post, his eyes drifting to the hill. "You ever figure out what's going on with that little rise back there?" he asked casually, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of the South. "Looks like it's grown some since I saw it last." George shrugged, not looking up from his work. "Just ground settling, I reckon." Ivan chuckled. "Settling? That thing's standing higher than a headstone. Maybe you got a family of armadillos tunneling around? Or maybe," he paused for dramatic effect, "some old moonshiner stash from way back when." George offered a thin smile but didn't respond. He had no interest in feeding Ivan's imagination or hearing his own unspoken thoughts reflected back at him. After a moment, Ivan tipped his hat and ambled away, leaving George alone with the silence and the rhythmic thud of his hammer on wood. That evening, as the sky darkened to deep blue and the first stars appeared, George found himself drawn to the hill once more. He stood there for a long time, his breath misting in the cold air. The barn cast a long shadow across the yard, and the silence was heavy, almost expectant, as if the earth itself was holding something it wanted him to find. He thought of his years overseas, of things soldiers buried in haste, sometimes never returning for them. The hill wasn't just bigger now. It was sharper in outline, more deliberate in its shape, as if whatever lay beneath was pushing upward with intention. Over the next few days he began noticing other small changes. The soil around the hill, it turned out, was harder than the rest of the yard, resisting frost in the mornings and drying faster during the day. A small crack had appeared along the crest, not wide enough to peer inside, but enough to suggest movement underground. He tapped it lightly with his boot heel and heard a muffled echo that sent a wave of unease through him. It wasn't the dull thud of loose earth. It was something else. At night, lying in bed, George found his thoughts drifting to that strange rise in the ground. He remembered the neighbors' joking words about moonshiners and armadillos, but his mind kept returning to the possibility of something older, something connected to decades before he had come to live here. He pictured previous owners, faces he barely knew, and wondered what secrets they might have left behind. He imagined a box, maybe wooden, maybe metal, lying beneath the soil for years, its edges pressing against the earth as time and weather shifted the ground around it. One night, when wind rattled the windows and a branch scraped against the siding, George lay sleepless, staring at the dark ceiling. A decision formed quietly but firmly in his mind. He would find out what was beneath that hill. Not immediately. He wanted the ground to dry after recent rains, but soon. The unease had rooted too deeply to ignore any longer. The hill had grown over the years, but so had his curiosity, and now it was the stronger force than his reluctance. By the end of the week the sky had cleared and winter sun brought pale warmth. One morning George stood on the porch, sipping coffee, his eyes fixed on the spot behind the barn. The decision was made. The day would come when he would take a shovel and dig until he found the truth. But for now he simply watched, the air between them heavy with unspoken understanding that their long standoff was nearing its end. What he didn't yet know was how much that decision would change the quiet rhythm of his life, how it would stir shadows from the past and bring to light things long thought buried, both in the earth and in the memories of those who had walked this ground before him. The hill was no longer just a quirk of the yard. It was a question demanding an answer, and George had finally decided he was ready to give it. The decision, once it had settled in his mind, grew heavier with each passing day. George had never been a man to rush into things without thought, but now the waiting itself was beginning to feel like a burden pressing down on him. Every time he went outside, the hill behind the barn seemed to loom larger, almost as if it had swelled overnight. His eyes drifted to it without his knowing, and he found himself unconsciously measuring its shape and height against what it had been a week ago. It was no longer simply a feature of his yard, it had become an unspoken challenge. The weather had turned clear, with pale winter sunlight spilling across the yard in long slanting rays. The air was cold enough to sting his cheeks but not so biting as to drive him indoors. That morning he ate a quiet breakfast at the small kitchen table, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock marking time as if urging him toward the inevitable. He rinsed his plate, slowly dried his hands with a worn towel, then opened the narrow closet where his tools leaned against each other in shadow. The old shovel, its wooden handle polished by decades of use, settled into his hand with the easy familiarity of an old friend. He set it aside, pulling on a pair of stiff work gloves and the heavy boots he had worn for years while working the ground. When he stepped outside, the fresh air filled his lungs, sharpening his senses. The yard was quiet except for the distant sound of a crow calling from the bare branches of an oak. Frost still clung to the shadowed edges of the fence line, but the ground near the hill lay exposed, as if the earth there held its own strange warmth. George approached slowly, each step sinking into the slightly damp soil. The hill in the slanted morning light seemed even more defined, its edges casting thin shadows that gave it a stubborn presence against the flatness of the yard. He stood for a moment, resting his gloved hands atop the shovel handle, letting his gaze slide over the rounded slope of earth. A faint, restless premonition prickled at the back of his neck. He thought again of Ivan's joking remark about moonshiner stashes, of his own memories from overseas where earth sometimes hid far more than stones and roots. He tightened his grip, stepped to one side of the hill, and drove the shovel blade into the soil. The first chunk came away easily. The earth was loose from months of rain and frost, and he tossed it aside with a muffled thump. He worked methodically, partially circling the hill, digging away one layer after another. At first it was simple resistance of packed soil, the kind he had wrestled with countless times before. But then, a few inches down, the shovel struck something harder than earth. The sound was faint but distinct, a dull metallic note that traveled up the wooden handle into his hands. He froze for a moment, his breath hanging in the cold air. Kneeling, he brushed away dirt with his gloved hands until the edge of something flat and rusted emerged from the soil. Rust had eaten into its surface, but the hard lines beneath were unmistakably the corner of a man-made object. His heartbeat quickened, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder toward the house, as if expecting someone to be watching. The yard remained quiet. He dug more carefully now, using the shovel to loosen surrounding earth before crouching to scrape it away with his hands. Slowly more of the object appeared. What looked like the lid of a large metal box, its surface covered with rust and caked with clumps of wet dirt. The metal was cold beneath his touch, as if it had held the chill of decades underground. A faint acrid smell rose from it, not unlike the scent of old machinery left too long in the rain. The box was larger than he had first thought, extending at least 2 feet across and perhaps more in length. Its sides were firmly wedged in the earth, as if the soil had gripped it in slow, inexorable embrace. He realized it would take more than a few minutes of work to free it completely. Straightening, he rolled his shoulders to loosen the stiffness settling there and began widening the hole, shovel by shovel, until he had exposed enough of the top to see a row of rusted hinges along one side. It occurred to him then that the hill's steady growth over the years made sense. Gradual shifts in groundwater and slow settling of earth had worked together to push the box upward, pressing against the surface until it formed the rise he had noticed so long ago. The thought gave him a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Whatever this was, it had been hidden for a long time, waiting for someone to uncover it. George set the shovel aside and crouched again, running his fingers along the edges of the box. The hinges were locked with years of rust, the seams nearly fused. He would need more than bare hands to pry it open. He stood, brushing dirt from his gloves, and walked to the barn, where he rummaged on a shelf until he found a heavy steel pry bar and an old hammer. The tools felt awkwardly heavy as he returned to the hill, their weight reminding him that what he was about to do could not be undone. Positioning himself at one corner, he wedged the tip of the pry bar under the lid's lip and slowly pressed down. Rust groaned in protest, and the box shuddered slightly in its earthen cradle. He worked around the edge, loosening Time's grip piece by piece, until finally a sharp crack split the air as one of the hinges gave way. The sound was louder than he had expected and seemed to echo in the yard silence. He paused, his breathing heavier now, and for a moment he simply stared at the partially freed lid. In his mind a dozen possibilities tumbled over each other. Old farm tools, forgotten valuables, or perhaps something much darker. A faint taste of metal and damp earth was strong now, mixing with a scent he couldn't quite identify, something that hinted at age and neglect. With one last push he pried the lid open enough to see darkness inside. At first it seemed empty, the interior swallowed by shadow, but as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. Hard edges, wrapped forms, and the dull gleam of something that caught the light. George's pulse quickened. The hole gaped before him, the box a silent relic from another time. And he knew there was no going back. Whatever lay inside had been buried here for a reason, and now it had found its way back into the world through his hands. The cold air seemed to freeze around him as he leaned closer, his breathing shallow, the damp soil beneath his knees. The box's contents waited in silence, keeping secrets that had survived much longer than he had lived here. And as he prepared to reach inside, a wave of unease passed through him. Not fear exactly, but a heavy awareness that what he was about to discover would draw him into a history that had begun long before he had ever set foot on this land. For a long moment George simply crouched there, staring into the open box as if his eyes might be deceiving him. The cold air pressed around him, deepening the silence until he could hear the slow rhythm of his own breathing. It took several heartbeats for the shapes inside to sharpen into recognition, and when they did, a chill ran through him. Not fear exactly, but something deeper and heavier, the kind you feel standing in the doorway of a room long left untouched. He hesitated, glancing once over his shoulder toward the fence line, half expecting to see someone watching, though the yard remained quiet and empty. He leaned closer. A smell met him before his hands did. A sharp mixture of rust, mildew, and the faint trace of old fabric that had been locked away from sunlight too long. The first thing he touched was rough cloth, stiff with age. Pulling it toward him, he saw it was a neatly folded military jacket, the color faded almost to gray, its once crisp edges softened by decades underground. The stitching was frayed in places, and a small moth hole marred the front pocket. He carefully placed it on the ground beside him, the insignia on the sleeve barely visible beneath a thin veil of dust. Beneath the uniform lay a bundle wrapped in waxed paper that had become brittle and yellow. George slowly peeled it away, revealing several small boxes of ammunition. The brass casings had tarnished to a dark patina, and each box was marked with neat military-style lettering that seemed oddly formal against their weathered appearance. He set them carefully aside, his hands steady but his mind racing with questions. Whoever had placed these here had done so deliberately, with a kind of care that spoke of value, if not in money, then in meaning. As he reached deeper into the box, his fingers closed around something cold and solid. He drew it into the pale light, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a pistol, heavier than he had expected, its blued steel dulled but not destroyed by time. The grip, worn smooth from use, still fit perfectly in his hand. For a moment he simply held it, the weight awakening echoes in him from his own years in uniform. This wasn't a casual relic, it had been carried, used, perhaps even trusted by someone who had lived and fought through times George could only know from history books and fragmentary memories of his elders. There were other items too. A narrow leather belt, neatly coiled at the bottom. A battered tin box containing what looked like personal effects. A small folding knife, a cigarette case with initials engraved in neat script, and a pair of dog tags strung on a chain. The tags were tarnished but still readable, letters and numbers stamped deep into the metal. Thomas Michael Carlson, followed by a string of digits and blood-type designation. George's gaze lingered on them. A name, a box, a uniform, a weapon. These weren't just things. They had belonged to a man who had lived in flesh and blood, who had carried these pieces of metal and cloth through moments of his life that were now lost to everyone but him. And then there was the bag. Tucked into the far corner, almost hidden beneath other contents, lay a thick canvas sack tied with cord that had hardened over the years. George pulled it out, the rough fabric scraping against his gloves. He untied the knot and opened the mouth of the sack, peering inside. At first he saw only the dull brown edges of paper, but when he reached in and pulled a stack into the light, reality struck him. Money, bundles of old bills, the paper fragile but still intact. Faded ink showed denominations he hadn't seen in decades. Some were bound with bank straps bearing seals of institutions long out of business, their names familiar only from old photographs and half-remembered headlines. George rocked back on his heels, the sack resting on his knees. The cold seeped through his coat now, unnoticed. His mind was a storm of questions. Who was Thomas Michael Carlson? Why had he buried all this here? The dog tags and uniform marked him as a soldier, but the money, weapon, and ammunition hinted at something more complex. This wasn't just a cache of mementos. It was a hidden chapter from a life that had been sharply cut off from the world above. He set the sack aside and looked into the box once more. At the very bottom lay a packet of letters bound with string so frayed it fell apart at his touch. The envelopes were yellowed, their corners softened, but the handwriting was still clear, a looping, deliberate script that belonged to another era. Most were addressed to Thomas Michael Carlson, but several bore the name Anna Carlson. George brushed dirt from one and turned it over in his hands, feeling the faint impression of a postmark. He didn't open them, not yet. There was a sense of intrusion in that act, a crossing of lines he wasn't ready for. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint creak of the barn door. George looked up at the yard, the fence, the fields beyond. It all seemed slightly changed now, as if the act of discovering this box had shifted something not just in the ground but in the very air around him. The hill was gone, reduced to a rough hole in the earth, but in its place was something much larger, a connection to a man he had never met, a mystery anchored in steel, cloth, and paper, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. George carefully gathered the items, arranging them in a neat row beside the box. The uniform, pistol, ammunition, belt, tin of personal effects, sack of money, and packet of letters. Each seemed to radiate its own quiet gravity, drawing his thoughts into its orbit. He felt as he had as a child when he'd found a bird's nest tucked into a barn rafter, the awareness that he was holding something delicate, irreplaceable, and alive with history. The light was fading by the time he got to his feet, his knees stiff from crouching. He carried the items to the barn, carefully placing them on the old workbench where they would be safe from the damp night air. The box itself, now empty, he left by the hole. Its rusted shell seemed smaller without its contents. He would deal with it later, for now his mind was too full of the weight of what he had found and the questions it had awakened. He locked the barn and stood for a moment on the path, the cold settling into his bones. The yard looked the same as always. The leaning barn, the weathered fence, bare branches reaching toward the darkening sky. But he knew better. This place had kept a secret for decades, and now that secret belonged to him. He wasn't sure yet what he would do with it, but he knew one thing. Thomas Michael Carlson's story was no longer buried, and neither was his own role in it. When George finally went inside, the warmth from the small heater wrapped around him but couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in his chest. He thought of the dog tags, the letters, the sack of brittle currency. And he knew that sleep wouldn't come easily. Somewhere in the distance a train whistle sounded, long and low like a voice calling across time. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the closed barn door through the window, and felt the pull of the past that he could no longer ignore. George woke earlier than usual the next morning, though he had barely slept. His dreams, when they came, were muddy and restless. Flashes of strange landscapes where the ground shifted beneath his feet, and where voices he couldn't see whispered names he didn't know. Pale winter light was just beginning to filter into the room when he threw back the blanket and sat on the edge of the bed. The cold floor bit at his feet, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were already in the barn with the relics he had unearthed less than a day ago. He brewed coffee strong enough to cut through the fog in his mind and stood at the kitchen window while it dripped into the pot. Outside, the yard looked unchanged. The barn leaned in its usual spot, the patch of bare earth where the hill had been now just a rough scar in the ground. But to George the entire scene seemed different, as if the air itself carried the weight of the past. He couldn't shake the image of those dog tags, the clean, deliberate letters spelling out a name that meant nothing to him and yet now seemed to follow him from room to room. After a second cup of coffee, he went out into the cold. The air was sharp enough that his breath hung before him. The barn lock gave a reluctant click, and the hinges protested weakly as he pulled the door open. Inside, the smell of oil and wood mixed with a faint mustiness that clung to the items from the box. The workbench was exactly as he had left it. The uniform neatly folded, the pistol resting to one side, the tin of personal effects, ammunition, sack of brittle currency, and packet of letters loosely bound by the tattered remains of string. George's hands hovered over the letters for a moment before he picked one up. The envelope was addressed to Thomas Michael Carlson in flowing handwriting. The ink faded but still readable. The postmark was dated 1946, just after the war's end. He carefully withdrew the letter, the paper crackling faintly. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, steady and confident, and the first line began with, "My dear Thomas." George read in silence, his eyes moving slowly across the page. The words spoke of homecoming, of relief that the war was over, of longing for a man who had been away too long. There were mentions of a small house, of a garden that had grown wild in his absence, and of nights spent wondering if he was alive. He set the letter down, his fingers lingering on the paper, and reached for another. This one, postmarked a year later, was shorter, the tone more urgent. It spoke of trouble, of people coming to the house with questions, of warnings to be careful, of pleas to keep the box safe. George felt a slow chill creeping through him as the words settled in his mind. This wasn't just a soldier's keepsake. The box had been hidden for a reason, and someone long ago had been afraid it might be taken. The dog tags lay where he had placed them the night before, and he picked them up now, running his thumb over the stamped letters. Thomas Michael Carlson. He spoke the name aloud quietly, as if it might awaken something in the barn's still air. Nothing answered, but the weight of the metal in his palm seemed heavier than it should. He pocketed them, an unspoken decision forming effortlessly. He needed to know who this man had been. George wasn't much for computers, but he knew the library in the center of town had old city records and newspapers in their archive. It had been years since he had stepped inside, but by mid-morning he was there, the building's warmth washing over him as he pushed through the glass doors. The librarian was younger than he had expected, a polite woman in glasses who listened as he explained he was looking for information about someone who might have lived in the area decades ago. She led him to a set of old-bound volumes and a microfilm reader tucked into a quiet corner. Hours passed in the library's low hum. George flipped through yellowed pages, scanning obituaries, wedding announcements, and old photographs. At first there was nothing, and then in a 1947 edition of the local paper he found it. A photograph of a man in uniform. The caption read, "Sergeant Thomas Michael Carlson returns home from overseas." The article was brief, mentioning his service in Europe, his receipt of a medal for valor, and his plans to settle in the town. There was no mention of family, though the name Anna Carlson appeared once, described as his sister residing in Richmond. George continued reading, moving forward through the years. In a 1953 paper there was a small, easily missed notice. Local resident Thomas Michael Carlson, 37, reported missing several weeks ago. Authorities have no leads at present. There was no follow-up article. No resolution. Just a man who had quietly disappeared from the public record. George leaned back in his chair, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead seeming louder in the silence. The pieces were there. Military service, homecoming, sudden disappearance. But the picture they formed was incomplete. He thought of the box again, of the pistol and money and letters that hinted at danger. A man had survived the war only to vanish a few years later, leaving his possessions buried in the earth behind what was now George's barn. Before leaving the library, George asked the librarian about property records. She showed him how to search old registries, and there he found the line he was looking for. The house and land had once belonged to Thomas Michael Carlson, sold in 1954 to a couple who lived there until the late 70s. The sale date was a year after Carlson had gone missing. George didn't know if this meant the man had sold it before disappearing, or if someone else had done so after he vanished. But either way, the timeline nodded at him. When he stepped back outside, the daylight was already beginning to fade. The cold bit sharper now, but George barely noticed. His thoughts were on the man whose name was now a constant presence in his mind. A man whose life had intersected with his own through nothing more than the luck or misfortune of shared ground. At home, he returned to the barn. The fading light pooled in the corners, and he looked again at the pistol, the money, the uniform. He pictured Carlson standing in this very yard almost 70 years ago, perhaps digging the hole himself, lowering the box into it, covering it with earth. Had he been afraid? Was he protecting something or hiding from someone? George felt a weight in his chest as he closed the barn door for the night. The answers weren't here, not yet. But the questions had taken root, and as he stood looking at the dark yard, he knew this was no longer just about curiosity. It was about a man's story that had been buried with him, about the pieces left behind and the truth hidden among them. The past was no longer content to lie quietly in the ground. It had surfaced, and now it held him. The days that followed his trip to the library were marked by a particular restlessness. George had lived alone long enough to know the rhythms of his property, the quiet hum of days that passed without incident. But now there was a new current in the air, an awareness that he was no longer the only one who held knowledge of what lay in that barn. Whether it was paranoia or instinct, he couldn't say. But he felt it in the way his eyes drifted to the road more often, in how the silence of night seemed more fragile than before. The weight of discovery was no longer just on his workbench. It had settled into the very tempo of his days. It started subtly. The first sign came on a gray afternoon when he noticed tire tracks in the thin strip of mud by the fence line. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to pass by, but these tracks had stopped strangely close to the edge of his property, as if someone had pulled over and sat there for a while. He told himself it could have been anyone, someone turning around, maybe even Ivan on his old pickup. But the thought didn't quite settle. Later that evening, as light drained from the sky, he thought he saw a figure standing just beyond the fence, a shadow among the bare trees. When he looked again, it was gone, and he told himself it was a trick of the fading light. Still, he lingered at the window longer than usual, watching darkness thicken. George tried to maintain his routines. He still tended the garden beds when weather allowed, still split wood for the small stove in the living room. But the barn had become both sanctuary and burden. He would unlock the door in the mornings, glance at the uniform, pistol, letters, and sack of old bills, then lock it again, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the air in there was changing, that the smell of age and metal seemed sharper, that shadows seemed to stretch longer across the workbench. 2 days after the first tire tracks, Ivan came by again. His visit was casual in tone but edged with something George hadn't heard before. They talked on the porch, wind carrying the faint smell of rain from the west. Ivan mentioned offhandedly that there had been strangers in town asking about old properties and who had lived on them in earlier days. Probably nothing, Ivan said, leaning against the railing. But sometimes when folks start digging into the past, they're not doing it for history's sake. He didn't look directly at George when he said it. George offered only a small nod, unwilling to invite more speculation, but the words took root in his thoughts. That night the sound of a car passing on the road pulled him from shallow sleep. It slowed as it approached his property, the crunch of tires on gravel distinct in the silence. He rose, moving to the window, but darkness outside was thick, and headlights swept the fence before turning away. He stood there long after, listening for any sound that didn't belong. And when he finally lay back down, sleep didn't come. The next morning he went to the barn earlier than usual. The lock was still in place, but for a moment he thought he saw the faintest scuff marks in the dirt near the door. He crouched, running his hand over them, but they could have been from an animal or from his own boots on a wet day. Still, the idea that someone might have been close enough to touch the barn door made his jaw tighten. He unlocked it and stepped inside, scanning the workbench. Everything was as he had left it, but he noticed a slight shift in the stack of letters, as if they had been disturbed and put back without care. He told himself he might have left them that way. He wanted to believe it. Later that day, while he was stacking wood near the porch, a man approached from the road. He was tall with a weathered face and a cap pulled low, his coat buttoned against the wind. He introduced himself as someone interested in the area's history and asked, in a voice that was too casual to be natural, whether George had found anything unusual on his land in all the years he had lived here. George's answer was steady, quiet. No. But the man's eyes lingered on the yard, then drifted to the barn. There was a pause before he tipped his cap and walked back toward the road, his steps unhurried, as if he wanted George to watch him leave. By evening the wind had picked up, rattling loose tin on the barn's side. George sat at the kitchen table with the dog tags in front of him, turning them over in his hands. He thought of Thomas Michael Carlson, of the warning in one of the letters to keep the box safe. He wondered if the man who had buried it had felt this same tension in the air, this same awareness that once something was hidden, it became both shield and target. The next day he decided to move the items from the barn to the house, at least temporarily. He waited until the road was quiet, then carried them one by one, carefully arranging them in a large old trunk in the corner of his living room. The pistol he wrapped in cloth before placing inside. The sack of money he tucked beneath the folded uniform. The letters he nestled between layers of fabric to keep them safe. When the trunk was locked, he felt a measure of relief. But it was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the knowledge that locks only keep out the unmotivated. The days grew shorter, evenings stretching into long hours of listening to the house settle and wind scrape along the eaves. Twice he thought he heard voices outside at night, faint and quickly fading. But when he stepped onto the porch there was nothing but darkness and restless trees. He began to understand that the silence he had valued for so long could become a kind of pressure, empty space into which unwanted things might slip. It was just after sunset one evening when he saw the figure again, this time standing openly at the edge of the yard near the fence. The man didn't move when George stepped onto the porch. He only watched. There was a pause long enough for George to feel the weight of that gaze before the man turned and walked away into shadows. George remained on the porch for some time after, his breath clouding in the cold. The thought of the trunk in the living room settled over him like a second layer of frost. That night, lying in bed, George realized that what had been buried in his yard all these years hadn't been forgotten by everyone. The shadows were closer now, their interest sharpened, and he understood this was no longer just about uncovering the past. The past had noticed him, and it was moving toward his door. The night after he saw the figure by the fence was the longest George could remember in years. He lay in bed with his eyes open, staring into darkness, the house's slow settling like faint footsteps overhead. Every time wind touched the siding or rattled loose tin on the barn, he felt his muscles tense. It wasn't fear exactly. It was knowledge that what had been set in motion the moment he dug into that hill was now moving toward its conclusion. He could almost feel the pull of it, like the slow current of a deep river drawing everything toward one inevitable turn. By morning his mind was clear. The uncertainty, the cautious waiting, the false hope that it might simply pass, all had thinned away. He brewed coffee but barely sipped from the cup. Instead he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old trunk in the corner. Its heavy brass latch gleamed in the pale light filtering through curtains. Inside lay the uniform, pistol, money, letters, and dog tags, the weight of another man's life and the shadow of danger that life had left behind. He understood then that he couldn't keep them. Not if he wanted peace to return to this house. The decision wasn't one he made lightly. For years George had lived with the quiet certainty that his life was his own, bounded by his land and his memories, free from the tangled affairs of other men. But this was no longer just his land, and these were no longer just his memories. He had stepped into someone else's story, and with that step had come responsibility. The thought of strangers in town, of the man who had stood in darkness by his fence, made it clear enough. If these things had value beyond sentiment, they would draw attention until someone took them by force. That day he called a man he had known from his service days, a retired sheriff named Michael Turner who lived 2 towns over. He didn't tell him everything over the phone, only that he had found something that might be of historical and legal importance, and that he wanted it handled properly. Michael didn't ask many questions, just said he would be there the next morning. With the decision made, George felt a strange calm settling over him, though it was colored with a kind of sadness. He spent the evening with the trunk open, looking one last time at each piece. The uniform still carried the faint smell of age and damp earth, the fabric rough beneath his fingertips. The pistol, cleaned now of the worst rust, was cool and solid in his palm, a tool made for certainty in uncertain moments. He ran his thumb over the engraved initials on the cigarette case and for a moment pictured Thomas Michael Carlson's face, though he had only that faded newspaper photograph to guide him. The letters were hardest to let go. He read several that night, letting Anna Carlson's voice come through the paper, steady and warm at first, then more urgent and edged with fear as months passed. There was love in her words, but also desperate need to protect her brother from whatever shadow was sliding into his life. George carefully folded each and returned it to its bundle. When dawn came, pale and cold, he had been awake for hours. He packed the trunk with the same care he might use for his own most precious things. He wrapped the pistol separately in oiled cloth, the money in thick brown paper, the letters between folded layers of the uniform to keep them from creasing. By the time Michael's old pickup truck pulled into the driveway, the trunk was closed and waiting by the door. Michael was a large man, his frame still broad despite the years, his handshake firm. He listened in silence as George told the story from the beginning. The hill, the digging, the box, the contents, the strangers who had appeared afterward. When George finished, Michael nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You did the right thing calling me," he said finally. "This is more than you want it to be." They carried the trunk together and placed it in the truck bed, covering it with a heavy tarp. Michael assured him it would go first to a safe place, then into the hands of people who could determine its proper home, whether museum, archive, or Thomas Michael Carlson's family, if any could be found. George didn't press for details. He trusted Michael to see it through. When the truck drove away, the yard seemed strangely quiet, as if holding its breath. George stood on the porch for a long time, watching the faint trail of exhaust disappear in the cold air. The ground where the hill had been was just bare earth now, the scar slowly softening under winter's touch. He knew that with the trunk gone, the interest from the shadows would fade. Whatever had drawn them here no longer rested on his land. In the days that followed, he noticed the difference. No more tire tracks appeared by the fence. No figures lingered in the distance at dusk. The nights were quiet and dark, as they had always been before, the kind of silence that settled in bones and let a man sleep deeply. But something had changed in him. He felt a connection to the man whose name had once been nothing more than letters on cold metal, a connection forged through the weight of objects and the silence of years. Spring would come in its time, bringing grass back over the disturbed earth, and with it the slow eraser of memory from the ground itself. But George knew he wouldn't forget. In the evenings when he sat on the porch and light faded in the trees, he sometimes imagined that somewhere in a place he couldn't see, Thomas Michael Carlson had found a kind of peace too. The box had been hidden to keep its contents safe, but perhaps after all these years the true safety lay in bringing them back to light. The last of the frost melted from the yard one morning, and George walked to the edge where the hill had once stood. The soil was still bare, but he had brought with him a small packet of seeds, wildflowers that would grow in a scatter of color come summer. He knelt and pressed them into the earth with steady hands. It wasn't a grave, but it felt like one in spirit, a quiet marker for a man's life and the secrets it had carried. When he stood, he looked toward the barn. Its leaning frame was just part of the background of his days again. Turning back toward the house, George felt the lightness that comes when a burden is finally set down. The past would always have its shadows, but they were no longer his to carry. And in the silence that had returned, he could hear for the first time in weeks the simple and familiar sounds of home: wind through branches, the creak of porch boards, and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the fence. Thank you for listening to the story until the end. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and loved ones. It motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that's about to appear on your screen. We're very grateful to have you with us. See you soon.